Good night.
I wish we, oh well.
Are you going to, would you like to kiss me good night?
Here.
Well, good night.
Hello and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm Oscar Perry Abello, and I'm the Senior Economics Correspondent at Next City. And it is my great honor and pleasure to moderate our closing keynote panel discussion this afternoon or morning. Just by way of introduction, so I'm coming to you from another part of unceded Lenni Lenape territory, still in some ways memorialized in the name of the borough where I live, which is Manhattan in New York, in what we call today New York City. I am a child of the descendants of the Spanish and US imperial regimes in the Philippines. I have short, black, close-cropped hair. I'm wearing glasses and a dark blue kind of striped shirt with a big ponytail palm behind me and some books and other plants on the shelf. And let me tell you a little bit about Next City for those who don't know who we are. We are an online publication and we were founded in 2003. And we cover social, racial, and environmental justice work in cities across the United States. We are an organization that believes in the need and the need for people to liberate cities from racial injustice, social injustice, environmental injustice, heteronormativism, disability injustice, and really all forms of all kinds of structural barriers that have been intentionally built into cities by previous generations of policymakers, business leaders, civic leaders, however you want to characterize them. We've inherited cities that were designed to benefit some and exclude others intentionally. And we write about initiatives, people, organizations who are trying to undesign those challenging cities and redesign and reimagine cities to work for everyone, starting with those who have been historically excluded from the benefits of living in cities. And so it was my great pleasure to have Mural Arts and Alexis Fraz invite me to moderate this panel for us today. And I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one. And we're going to have them talk about each of their work a little bit just by way of introduction in the beginning of the panel. And just in terms of framing, first let me say thank you to Magda for her comments, her voice, and her spirit. Just echoing everyone's comments in the chat about how powerful that was and how important it is to kind of set the conversation up with how she put things at the beginning, especially with the song. You know, the idea of the sun is not for sale, the rain is not for sale. We live in an economy, as many of you know, that wants to put everything for sale. You know, here in New York City, as in many cities, air is for sale. Air rights are a thing. You know, if you're a church and you have the ability to build 5 more floors above you in New York City, but you don't have those floors, you can sell that to a developer to use those floors on the lot next door to you. And that does happen in New York City every year. We sell air. We transfer air rights. And that is just one of countless examples of this economy built, designed intentionally to benefit some and exclude others, right? And the policies and practices, and it's very important to include practices too, because it's not all written down, codified policies. A lot of it these informal practices that result in an economy where you can buy and sell air rights. Those policies and practices come out of stories. And the stories that go back all throughout the history of this country. Stories that were used to justify the passage and implementation of policies that resulted in the specific exclusion of Indigenous folks, Black folks, immigrant folks from the benefits of living in this country and living together in cities. You know, the stories that today, and especially for many of us, even some who might consider themselves opponents of racism, and they would still think something like the narrative or the image of the coon or the jigaboo or the Jezebel or the Manny. These things are horrible stereotypes that of Black people in the past used to justify slavery. Well, they weren't only used to justify slavery. They were used to justify many policies and practices which we still see in place today. You know, policies and practices that result in Black neighborhoods being undervalued by over $156 billion just because Black people live there. The policies that result in Black businesses being undervalued and doing less in revenues just because Black people own them. Same for Indigenous folks. Same for immigrant folks, Latino folks, and certain segments of Asian immigrant populations, right? People descended from immigrants from Asia. You know, the policies and practices that we see leaving certain people out are rooted in certain narratives. And I'll just give you one of my favorite ones is that I like to think about it, I talk about a lot is the idea of, you know, the heroic entrepreneur, of the rugged individualism, lift up your bootstraps, that the entrepreneur will save us. That sort of narrative that took hold in the 60s and 70s in the U.S. and also in Great Britain, because we will hear from Great Britain today from Dan and Hilary. You know, in that for Great Britain it was Margaret Thatcher. For the U.S. it was Ronald Reagan, right? These policymakers were, you know, sat atop mountains of other policymakers who had all bought into this narrative of like the entrepreneur drives everything, and you have to deregulate everything to free entrepreneurs to save us all from laziness or whatever it was that they wanted us to save. They needed saving from. We apparently needed saving from. So you deregulated so many sectors, especially the banking sector in the 80s. And so what happened? Well, from the 1930s to the 1980s, we had about 15,000 banks and also 15,000 credit unions, fairly steady the whole time. For the data we have, we can see we had a consistent number of banks despite all the technological changes from the 30s to the 80s. But starting in the 1980s with the deregulation under Ronald Reagan, we went from 15,000 banks and 15,000 credit unions. Today, we have less than 5,000 banks and around 5,000 credit unions in the US. That's dramatic economic transformation, rooted in policies that were rooted in narratives that drove all of that change. That's not the transformation I think we all want or want to see, but it's transformation, and it shows that transformation is possible still today, not that long ago, and it's rooted very deeply in narratives. And so we're going to talk a lot today about what are some of the narratives, what are some of the ideas, what are some of the ways we could run our economies differently? What are some of those policies and practices we could do that would be different, that are rooted in other narratives, other stories, other values that come out of the conversations like those you've had this week during these convenings that Muriel Arts has organized. Conversations that include songs like the song that Magda brought to us just a minute ago. You know, those conversations about what's wrong with the economy today, the longer you stay in those conversations, the longer you stay in relationship as people in those conversations, the more you eventually get to, well, what can we do differently? You know, how can we own businesses? How can we run the economy differently? And so we're going to hear from three different folks who are part of three different conversations, but all sort of reflect this idea that, you know, having those conversations about what's wrong eventually can bring us to ideas of how to run the economy that are different. And so let me start with Esteban Kelley, who is the executive director of the US Federation of Worker Cooperatives. And Esteban, I think if your camera can turn on in a minute. Okay, here's Esteban. So Esteban, you're based in Philadelphia as well. So tell us what are worker cooperatives? Why are they so important? You know, what is it that they represent an alternative to in the dominant economy today?
Thanks, Oscar. Yeah, it's good to be here. I'm really excited to be joining you all here. I'm wearing a pink shirt. I'm in a teal room and surrounded by plants and books and a guitar behind me that actually you probably can't. Yeah. So some things about worker cooperatives. Basically, worker cooperatives are businesses that are owned and run cooperatively by the people who work there on a daily basis. So it's slightly different from other forms of cooperatives that might be based around the shoppers or the clients or the patrons of a particular business. Here we're talking about businesses, which in the US, they're mostly small businesses, even micro businesses around 10 to 15 people. Maybe the average size is 50. And they're in every possible sector of the economy, from healthcare to transportation, retail and service sector things, business support like language interpretation and bookkeeping. So we're in every possible industry, and we just sort of bring our own approach to the business, which is that we share the risk in starting up those businesses or expanding them, taking on debt or loans, and then we also share the rewards. So the fruits of our labor, literally, I mean, the profits, the surplus gets redistributed equitably to the workers who produce it. And depending on the structure of the cooperative, sometimes that's equitably, meaning everyone literally gets the same portion, and sometimes it's proportional to the amount of labor that you put in. But the decision for designing and deciding how profit sharing gets allocated all rests with the General Assembly of the workers overall. Depending on the size of cooperative businesses, some of them might have a board of directors that's comprised 100% of the workers there, usually 100%. But some of them might just be a committee of the whole. If it's small enough, like in my cooperative, AORTA, which stands for Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, there's only 12 or 13 of us. And so when we have a board meeting, it's just everybody. It looks the same as a staff meeting, but our agenda is a little different because we might be deciding things about hiring somebody or approving our annual budget or taking on loans from the Small Business Administration and things like that.
Thanks, Esteban. And can you say a little bit about so how many worker cooperatives are in the US right now? What's the trajectory been over the past couple of years?
Yeah, so the Worker Co-op Federation was founded in 2004, and we only really started collecting data about the sector a couple years after our founding. We don't really get support from the US government, which is a little different from other countries that have a robust cooperative economy. Often there's a minister of cooperatives that's an advisor to the prime minister or the president. And obviously things are really different here. You've probably never heard of a secretary of cooperative economies in the US. It's because we don't have one. So having collected that information ourselves and knowing that our reach, because it's quite a big country and quite a big economy, our reach is limited. So we don't always know about every cooperative. I mean, if your cousin started a co-op, would I know about it necessarily, right? Especially if it was just, a small, like 3 people doing landscaping or construction, we might not know about it. So our estimate is that there's somewhere between 800 and 1,000 worker co-ops in the US. And we have about half of that, maybe a third of that in our membership right now in the Worker Co-op Federation. And there are certain concentrations, because one of the things we know about cooperative development is that the stronger a local ecosystem is, the easier it is to sort of catalyze and incubate expansion and development, or even mimicry for people to be inspired by another worker co-op that's in their community or in their neighborhood, to have formal or informal business relationships, mentorship, even financial support like loans or initial investment. So bigger concentrations are in the Bay Area and the state of California at large. New York, actually New York City just became the largest concentration of worker co-ops just in the last few years, with the support of city council that's been that kicked off an initiative about 7 years ago directly supporting worker co-op business development. So New York State is big, even beyond New York City. Massachusetts is probably third, and there's certainly concentrations in the Midwest, in the Great Lakes region. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Esteban. So next I want to bring up Laura Zabel. So Laura is the Executive Director of Springboard for the Arts. And Laura, tell us a little bit about where you're coming from and what, and in particular, at Springboard for the Arts, you recently launched a guaranteed income for artists program, and there's a similar program that's been launched in other places. But what is guaranteed, in addition to your organization and where you're coming from, what is guaranteed income an alternative to in the dominant economy?
Yeah, thanks so much, Oscar. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you. My name's Laura Zabel. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman in my 40s with mid-length brown hair. I have on a light purple shirt, and I'm sitting in my office, which is also my bedroom, in front of my bookcase and some pieces of embroidery, which has been my keep my hands off my phone strategy for the last year or so. Yeah, so Springboard for the Arts is a nonprofit organization. It's an artist-run organization. Everyone on the staff is a practicing artist. We're based in Minnesota, both in the urban area of St. Paul and in a rural community called Fergus Falls. Both of those locations are on land that was and is the homeland of the Ojibwe and Dakota people. I think an important sort of table setting piece for Springboard is that we have a really broad definition of who artists are. And in particular, we define art as meaning making in everyday life. And our work is really about and prioritizes supporting artists who haven't been historically resourced by the existing systems, and in a lot of cases have been extracted from and devalued by those systems. So artists who are Black and Indigenous and people of color, artists who are immigrants, GLBTQ artists, artists with disabilities, artists in rural places. And I think a lot of our work is kind of characterized by things that other people might see as contradictions, but that we see as assets. So we are both urban and rural. We are both deeply place-based and neighborhood focused and also national. And a lot of our work is both really practical, like really interested and focused on connecting people directly with resources, but also I think serves as a kind of metaphor, we hope it does, a kind of vision for a future world and demonstrations of what else is possible. And what that looks like from a practical perspective is that we make programs that are direct resource programs for artists. So things, like help with setting up businesses and legal issues, support for health and wellness, other kinds of kind of practical direct resources. One of the biggest in the last year is that we've been really focused on emergency relief, of course, for artists. And then we also make programs that are about how communities connect to and plug into their own creativity, the artists and culture bearers who live and work in those communities. So just in the last year, we've done programs that are about how artists can make work in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, artists who've made work helping address social isolation in vulnerable communities during the pandemic, artists who are making work to address more equitable rural futures and telling a different story about what rural is. And I think how we came to guaranteed income over the last year is really first through the emergency relief fund work. So we, in a typical year, Springboard has an emergency relief fund that raises about $10,000 and supports about 20 artists. And in the last year, we raised $1.5 million and supported 2,500 artists just in our region alone, and built a kind of national network of other emergency relief funds. And we're really seeing people, I think, observe and understand the fragility of artists' lives and their livelihoods in a way that they hadn't before, alongside, I think, a growing awareness of how fragile so many people's lives are and how much our economy has come to rely on gig work and contract work and systems that don't have any support structure behind them and certainly don't have any safety net. There's a kind of widely quoted statistic that a majority of Americans can't support a $400 emergency in their lives. And I think the last year, if I have my optimistic hat on, the last year has exposed that to a lot more people. And I think more people understand that. So we really, I think, felt like there was an opportunity to not just do things that are in the mode of emergency relief or this kind of stopgap help, but to really try and test out or experiment with bigger systemic change. And when I think about what artists need economically, I always come back, like all roads lead back to what artists need is the same thing everyone else needs. And they need an economy that works for more people. They need things like healthcare. They need things like childcare and student loan debt forgiveness. They, need renter protections. And so thinking about that and kind of looking to where people were really stepping out and trying things, and the kind of network of Mayors for Guaranteed Income and the real acceleration of the movement around guaranteed income in the last year, we were able to learn a lot from that movement and also kind of identify that artists should be a part of that conversation, both as participants and potential beneficiaries, but also because they have so much to offer in terms of the narrative change and the culture shift that needs to happen for our economy to actually change. So like you said, we launched a guaranteed income pilot here in St. Paul in our neighborhood specifically to support artists. And of course, the goal is to directly support artists, but I think our bigger kind of more system goal is to use this pilot to both generate research and connection to these broader movements so that we can do more work in solidarity across worker-led movements and movements for economic justice to make sure that artists aren't just kind of brought in at the end to make the poster, but are actually a part of that work and seen as part of the population that needs to be represented in that work.
Right. Yes, I think, in terms of guaranteed income, all these pilots that are popping up in cities across the country over the past, there's been a big wave over the past year, but there's been the Stockton example that's been going on for about 3 years, a Jackson, Mississippi example that's been going on for now 4 years. Those examples are going on across the country, but the idea is to make it, to build a case for guaranteed income as part of a larger federal social safety net. To summarize it in a way that I think would make sense for this conversation, that the idea is to generate stories, narratives that show this is something we should have as a society, because the narrative that took hold also in the 80s was, the welfare queen. And if you just give out money, people just won't work, and they'll be lazy, and they just the data we know now after Stockton and Jackson shows that actually people are more likely to find full-time employment if they get guaranteed income as part of the social safety net. We know that now from Stockton. We're seeing that coming out of Jackson. In Jackson, we're seeing data like households with children that get guaranteed income, their children do better in school as a result of having this guaranteed income. And so hopefully, you're starting up your guaranteed income experiment now, pilot now in the Twin Cities in St. Paul, and the idea is to generate, okay, so what also would be the benefit to us, all of us, not just the artists, but to all of us, if artists are also, if this exists, would we have more lively, more vibrant cultural scene as a result of artists and just having guaranteed income and seeing that artists are a part of that, not just not welfare queens, because that the welfare queen is a myth, right? And we're trying to generate actual real stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. I think that's part of our aim. And I think, to me, something that's really compelling to me about the ideas behind guaranteed income are both that, like you're saying, the pilots that have been happening for a while already have really great research that shows that it does improve people's economic position. They're able to spend the time to find better, more meaningful work that pays better. They're able to improve, their ability to handle those kind of unexpected financial emergencies. But the other thing it does that I'm also really compelled by, that I think really connects to the role of arts and culture and artists specifically in communities, is that I think it also speaks to kind of trying to unlink our value as individuals, as humans, as members of a community, just from our ability to return economically. So it does do all of those things that I think help improve folks' economic situation, but it also, I think, speaks to sort of the dignity and value and the recognition that people bring other things of value to their community besides just how much they increase the tax base. That providing cultural opportunity, doing activities in your community, bringing forth or preserving culture that's existed in a place for a long time. Those are all things that have tremendous value and are a form of wealth in a community that I'm really interested in recognizing and kind of naming in that way. And I think from a neighborhood perspective, those are also reasons that people are able to stay and root in place. And I think, particular to artists, there's a really interesting set of questions around whether supporting artists with guaranteed income is a way for a neighborhood or a community or a place to preserve some of their existing culture in a way that makes people continue to feel welcome there, continue to feel like that's their place, and mitigate some of the potential impact of displacement that of course happens both economically and culturally.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura. So now I'll bring in our last panels, or set of panelists, really, and they're artists and filmmakers, Dan and Hilary Powell, who come to us from the United Kingdom. And their work is, as artists and filmmakers, their work really questions the idea of, like, what is money? So, Laura, we're talking about who gets access to money and capital, but now you have Dan and Hilary, your work is actually questioning what is money anyway, and how should we think about it as societies. And so Dan, Hilary, I think you also have a little bit of hopefully you'll have a little bit of film to share with us too, I think. Did we get that worked out, or?
I'm not sure if we,
All right.
I don't know if I dare do that in front of so many people, actually, to be totally honest, but I'll just introduce myself quickly. I'm Dan. I'm a white man, and I have luscious blonde hair and brown eyes, and I'm sitting next to Hilary.
Hello, yeah, I'm Hilary. We're sitting in our small office in a terraced house in London. For us, it's the evening and it's very windy. It's strange weather. I'm in a red and white top that I've made an effort to wear. I actually got jeans and boots on underneath, so to present better for Zoom. And yeah, together, well, I'm an artist, and together we worked on a project called Bank Job, which was really kind of a long-term, all-encompassing project that, tackled ideas of money and debt at the core of it. And maybe Dan can start with kind of the origins of that, which actually originated back in USA with strike debt.
Yeah, that's right. So we heard about this group who were connected to Occupy Wall Street, who were buying up and then abolishing millions of dollars worth of student debt. And it was, interesting. I studied history at university originally, and and through that, I understood some economic history. But, in researching why the group were buying up and abolishing debt, I bought a book by Professor Andrew Ross from New York University called Creditocracy and the Case for Debt Refusal. And when I opened it and started to read it, I felt shackles were falling from my eyes. And it was the story which you yourself are telling today, which is about a kind of a creditor class who was stripping away at the sort of institutions of democracy and wrapping debt around access to basic social goods. And for them, their story revolved around the US. But I was interested to find out if Britain was also a creditocracy or turning into what they would call a creditocracy. So, I visited them in America and learned all about this debt buying and why they were up to it and all the rest of it. And then I brought back some of these concepts and I brought them into the area of London where we're now sitting, which is Northeast London, and started to work with Hilary on how we could begin to visualize it and create some form of story like you guys are talking about, which could expose, a predatory system and also begin to ask questions about how we might begin to overcome it.
Yeah, it took a while because you're dealing with these kind of big abstract kind of ideas of money and debt that often go over people's heads, and ours, to find a way into that. And my practice had always been working kind of more participatory in communities, creating kind of public, collaborative public projects. So we kind of built on that and came up with the idea from learning more about how money was made from a group called Positive Money over here, who talked about basically the production of money and its relationship to debt. We thought, well, what if we gave ourselves power of central banks to print money? And we actually set up a bank in our local community and printed money. And what would we do if we had that power? So we got hold of a abandoned bank building on a high street in London. Like all across the country, all these banks are closing down and these kind of shell of public space, the high streets are dying. We managed to get that in, I think now March 2018, and got to work printing money. But the money that we were printing didn't feature the Queen or famous people like Darwin. We kind of picked out people in the local community that we'd started to work with and realized that they were really fighting the fallout of this unjust economic system. So our banknote featured Gary, who ran the local food bank, Syra and her family, who run a homeless kitchen, Steve and Josh, who run a youth project to keep kind of spurred on by the fact that Steve's cousin had died of knife gang violence, and that it, to kind of keep people out of trouble like that. So it's such a vital resource, and they've just lost their building. And Tracy was the other banknote, and she was the head teacher of our primary school. And we employed a whole kind of team of local people to learn printmaking processes in this public bank. And we set to work printing money, exchanging it for sterling in order, this was kind of our mechanism in order to raise the money we needed to buy up and destroy, at that time, aiming for £1 million of local predatory debt.
And also to feed in, so we raised £40,000. Half of the money we put into the local causes that we were arguing were picking up the pieces of the broken system. So the food bank, the homeless kitchen, the youth project, and the school. So we put £5,000 into each of those causes. And then the 20,000 we used to buy up the £1.2 million worth of high interest local debt.
So the whole kind of exercise of this was really, like, we didn't know that this was going to work, but we opened this kind of bank on a wing and a prayer, like wondering if anyone was going to come in. But we programmed in lots of kind of economic, I think they were called money talks, economic education kind of program that kind of fused trying to inviting kind of bigger name speakers like authors like David Graeber to talk with local cooperatives and kind of looking at different economic models. And they proved really popular, because we were on a high street, people were walking in, and a kind of real buzz came about, and there was press, and it kind of built this momentum. So we raised the money, so we knew we could kind of cancel this debt. But because we're making a film of this whole process, and it's all kind of based on the idea of that it's a community heist against the financial system. We then kind of went into production making bonds, again playing around with these kind of instruments of finance to raise the capital to then quite literally explode this debt in an action called Big Bang 2 in front of the towers of Canary Wharf. And it was really important for us to do that there as this kind of symbolic cry against exactly what you were talking about, that moment of Thatcher in the 80s and this deregulation. So it's been a long old project, but it's kind of that way of kind of thinking through making and tackling these big issues through participatory, hands-on kind of practices.
Yeah, and Canary Wharf, just for folks who may not be familiar, Canary Wharf is like the Wall Street of like London, I think, right? Or the financial district, whatever you want to call it. And what I really like about this, your story is, it is a piece of art, a work of art, several works of art, really, right? Documentary, the storefront, sort of experiential. There's also a book here involved, and then the actual blowing up of a bunch of debt. You literally blew it up. It's a piece of art, and it's also very much rooted in a movement that I know goes back very deep in England and Europe and the United Kingdom. Like the debtors move, debtors, we're trying to fight back against debt has been, something in European history has been over and over again. Like the Catholic Church used to have Jubilee years. Like there used to be a thing, forgiving of debt every 7 years. Like that was the thing. And it's a movement, and the idea is to draw people back into and illustrate the newer and modern forms of a very old form of repression, which is debt.
It's kind of so we're having problems with our Zoom this side. So I don't know if you guys, but if it's just us. But we lost the last of your question, but it seemed as if you were saying that this is a kind of like the latest iteration of a process of debt refusal, or the cry for Jubilee, which we've had in the Western world over and again, and I guess most recently in Britain, or originating from Britain, we had it in the year 2000 with the Drop the Debt campaign. Kind of spearheaded by Anne Pettifor, and there was Bono involved and Tony Blair and all sorts of other people, and there was a big movement for billions of dollars worth of debt in the global South to be dropped, and which was successful. But there has never really been in Britain a clear movement, to abolish household debt over here. There hasn't been any organizations bold enough to name a number and to really get behind doing something with clarity. And there is an organization here called, which is a kind of legacy organization called the Jubilee Debt Campaign, and they are, they're continually providing information, but largely around global South debt and not about British debt. So I guess we sort of were so inspired by everything Strike Debt, and you're right, someone has mentioned that they're now called the Debt Collective. We were so inspired by everything that they did, and just their bravery at standing up to be counted. And they seem to be like a kind of bunch of noble outlaws. To me, they reminded me of the Bob Dylan line, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." There was something just so inspiring about them that we wanted to see if that could be done in Britain, and not to do it in a muddled way. We love the clarity of the Debt Collective and the clarity of their demands, and the clarity of their analysis as well. And and at first, we had a PR person when we first launched the bank on the high street who told us it was far too lofty and no one would ever understand it. But people did understand it, and people were always underestimating, the minds of the general public. They get it. They really do. It's not rocket science. The economy is not as complicated as we're told that it is, and the sort of language of high finance, the priests of high finance, and the tracts that they write and publish, you know, are actually, you know, overcomplicated, you know, very often. And people like to get involved, and they understand and they want to make that change, you know, and there's a huge appetite for it. And I think that sometimes it reminds me of like a rainstorm, you know, on parched ground, you know, they're just, you know, the earth needs that, you know, nourishment, you know. I think people want change. And in Britain, you know, we have a very right-wing conservative government at the moment. And there's probably about 40 to 45% of people in Britain who have quite a progressive ideas and want to kind of have a welfare democracy and look after one another. They're not represented by government in any way whatsoever. So there is like this kind of underrepresented, millions of underrepresented people, you know, and there's a lot that we can do. Even if we cannot change, you know, the government right now, we can still enact things in the here and now. And yes, that's right. They did have a little, yes, Phoebe, they did have a little campaign last year about household debt, but they're not going for it on the scale and the level that needs to be done. You know, that's all I'm saying. Anyway, I'm going to pass back to Hilary or over to you.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, guys. So I want to bring back Esteban and Laura now, and you know, we'll bring back the whole panel. And just as a reminder, everyone, if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring that the whole time. And let me just throw back another question now to either Esteban or Laura. So, you know, tell us a little bit about, you know, I proposed this question initially as like, who do you need to convince to get behind your idea, whether it's worker cooperative or guaranteed income? And I still would like you to answer that question, but I also would want to expand it a little and just ask, how does storytelling show up in your work? You know, for instance, Laura, I've heard in my other reporting about guaranteed income, I've asked folks, what's the hardest part about guaranteed income? And the hardest part is talking to the policymakers about the program. The policymakers who are still trapped in the welfare queen mindset, and you have to have that conversation over and over and over again. And that's been the response, is pushing back against that narrative and the storytelling, the fact that you have to build the stories, make the stories happen, and real stories, like we said, not myths, real stories. And you have to go out and actually tell that to folks. So I don't know who wants to go first, but yeah, how does storytelling show up, and who needs to hear these stories?
Well, I was actually going to start by making a connection directly to Laura's work, which is something, an initiative that we started for freelancers. It's a freelancer co-op initiative. We've branded it as Gilded, Gilded with a U, as in a guild of independent workers. And part of the core of that model for us is around guaranteed, not necessarily guaranteed income, but guaranteed payment. And so we've rolled out the pilot initially working with artists and creative freelancers, and because for all the reasons we've been talking about, I mean, they're some of the most precarious. I mean, among precarious workers, they're some of the most precarious. And actually, a little morsel of the storytelling piece, I think it's interesting that very few people in our society have a story of artists as workers, including artists themselves. Right. So we've internalized that story. And I think that part of what I'm interested in talking about with you all is shifting who the protagonists are when we think about the new economy. And that was just beautifully illustrated by our friends in the UK, just thinking about debtors and the work that we're doing here, led by Astra Taylor and folks at the Debt Collective. So that's part of it. And at the core of our business model for Gilded is this idea that a lot of freelancers have clients, they have work. The problem is that freelancers are often not paid on time. They're not paid in a timely way. Sometimes they're not paid at all, right? And so like we had a research project with the Freelancers Union as part of our partnership, where they tracked what they called the longest invoice and just how many months and years it took for somebody who had done work to finally get paid. And they mapped this out for hundreds of, maybe thousands of freelancers in New York City. And what happens if we see ourselves, artists, creatives, independent workers, as creditors, right? Our story is, oh yeah, this is owed to me. I'm grumpy about it. It's not, time is money. You owe me interest on that. Right? So we don't have the infrastructure to pursue debt that is owed to us. Meanwhile, any debts that we owe, I mean, we're getting late fees and we're getting dinged all over the place, right? Whether it's housing, food, like all the different things that we need in our lives. And so part of what we're doing with Gilded is a guaranteed payment, right? So we become the client, in other words, and we interface as a larger firm that's aggregating all of the different independent workers under one cooperative. We send out the invoice, we send the reminders, we iron out the contracts and make sure that it's an ironclad contract. We make sure that we have a whole legal department that's doing underwriting for that. And when you, as a firm, and that could be a university, that could be an independent, program, that could be a venue, when you get the invoice from us, it's just very different than saying, oh yeah, Cliff played a gig and we owe him money at some point. We'll get back to it because our cash flow, we'll get around to it later because our cash flow is in a crunch. So we're like, no. we will bug you to make sure that you make good on this deal. And in fact, we'll tack on late fees. And in the meantime, we are capitalizing a guaranteed payment fund. This is all modeled after the tremendous work that our friends and partners in the EU developed, mostly based out of Belgium and France, called Smart EU. They've expanded to 8 to 10 different countries, and when they were bringing the model to the US, they sought us as partners who understand cooperative structures and what it means to treat workers as workers, and to build up the kind of infrastructure we need for our rights and for our economic livelihood. And so what we're doing is capitalizing this fund, which then means that once you set up that contract, if you're supposed to be paid on June 1st, we'll make sure that you're paid on June 1st out of our coffers, no matter what. And then it's our business to make sure that we're collecting those funds. The other things that we do around, connection to health insurance and tax preparation, that's kind of add-on support. We have technical assistance providers who can help figure out what kind of permitting you need for some of the projects you might be working on, to get a visa if you're doing something overseas, just some of that wayfinding. What kind of liability insurance do you need to do a photo shoot on a bridge by a waterfall or whatever. So that stuff is add-on, but the real beating heart of it is this idea of guaranteed payment. So wanted to throw that in the conversation as well.
I think the work that Gilded is doing is so exciting, and I think really speaks to I think this need for things to not be kind of single interventions, but to feel more systemic and more connected, so that it isn't just the guaranteed payment, but that it is connected to these other resources. And that I think by doing that, by building that kind of ecosystem approach, that also builds power for people who are participating beyond just a kind of exchange of service. There's a kind of collective sense of people's growing and ability to kind of engage their power and agency together. So I also want to add to this conversation, Oscar, to your question about like what's the hardest thing to change or what needs to change in terms of the narrative. There are these big things we've already talked about in the kind of broad public narrative about, you brought up, the myth of a welfare queen, or the current, mythology that is really being pushed right now around there being a worker shortage because people are on unemployment and they would rather stay on unemployment than take a terrible job that has no safety net, that doesn't pay them anything, that can't support their family. So there are those broad economic narratives that need to be changed. And I really believe that artists can be a really important part and ingredient and support in doing that narrative change work. But I also want to bring into this conversation that I think for us, one of the biggest goals of our work and one of the biggest challenges in our work is changing people's idea of who artists are, both artists themselves and the kind of external environment. And there are a bunch of pieces of that I really believe here in the US that we have done to ourselves as a field, as the kind of organized field of arts and culture, that have kind of separated artists from normal people and have kind of placed artists outside as a kind of outside force that doesn't exist anywhere geographically, but I just might come into your community, as opposed to people who already live and work in your community already. And that's so tied to white Western ideas of kind of validation and I'm using air quotes, quality, that I think have been really, really harmful in people's understanding of the role of arts and culture in their daily lives, the role of artists in their neighborhood, their own artistic capacity, in the way that it could build power and agency and voice for themselves. And so I feel like part of the guaranteed income piece and some of these other ideas, like the work that Esteban's talking about, those are also kind of direct challenges to the existing arts kind of infrastructure here and the organized, institutionalized art support system, to say, what if we step out of systems that have historically said, well, we will decide who the 6 best artists are in this city and they are the ones who will get support, but we don't really give a fig about whether people have access to their own creativity or whether people are able to come together around culture and creativity locally, or whether there's any system of support or value placed on the kind of everyday practice of creative practice or creative process. And I feel like that's one of the biggest narrative shifts that we need to make, and that that I think comes from our participation and more participation from artists in these other movements. So not kind of seeing these issues as kind of siloed solutions for artists, or artists as a special group of people who deserve a particular kind of intervention, but how do we get ourselves in a position to be more supportive and in more solidarity with these other economic justice movements, so that they might begin to see us as part of who is included and who that population is, and also understand our value, and so that we can learn from those movements and understand that there is, decades and generations of work around economic justice that has already happened, and we don't need to kind of go reinvent or invent our own thing off to the side, which I think is a really common pitfall of the kind of organized field of arts and culture.
Dan and Hilary, I don't know if you have anything to add in terms of, who needs to be convinced, or, I mean, it's sort of obvious, as your artists and filmmakers, how storytelling and art shows up in your work. But, the question is sort of, what are some of the gaps in terms of, so you want to bring up the characters of and use debtors as the protagonists coming together and actually like helping each other cancel each other's debt in some ways, in real ways. And what are some of the other sorts of gaps you think there are in the storytelling around debt and money?
Oh gosh, well, there was so much in what Laura was saying that was just so relevant to that thinking. I suppose the main thing is, the key thing in the bank job was that this idea that we're all in this together, that there is not this debtor other, that we're all part of the same kind of system, and we can have power when we work together. And that was really kind of the joyful part of doing the bank job. And I suppose another thing that Laura was mentioning about the fact that this is our home place, and we weren't like parachuted in to do some kind of like, swanky commission on the high street. We built this from our community with all of those trials and errors and the kind of the politics of these close relationships and negotiations. And that's kind of continuing for us, which kind of links to this idea of the cooperative too, because we've just set up a cooperative energy company for our street, and we're embarking on our next project called Power, which again, like debt and money, is tackling one of these big, big kind of concepts and realities, but through building it on this kind of scale of artists being in and part of a community and kind of empowering ourselves to have our own voices and everyone around us to take their stand in this kind of fight. So yeah, there's so much in there with those kind of connections and this idea of the artist value, which I think we found, yeah, in the beginning of this project, no economists would talk to us because we're not, you're not qualified to speak in this field, and I think sections of the art world, not that we were really in it over here, just kind of don't consider this art or the labels that are given to this kind of thing as local or community to kind of diminish it. And you're like, but actually its power is in that, and that, so yeah, all of these things are swirling around, and the fact the kind of Dan's been working on a whole kind of methodology of bypassing the gatekeepers, and for us that's come through building a online community that goes beyond the local to kind of a global kind of network that are, in the case of our new project, actually putting financial support behind the project and coming into it from its very beginnings and learning together as we go and sharing that through the use of our tools of filmmaking and Dan's kind of social media skills. So
yeah, we're trying to we've got a membership site called the Powerful, and within that we try to take anyone that joins on the journey of tools that we're using to empower ourselves and that they can use, which really is like direct to audience marketing and building that up so that, whether the Arts Council like it or not, or whether, the newspaper wants to write a negative or a positive review, or the art world hate us or whatever, it really matters a lot less, So trying to decentralize that type of power, that Laura was discussing a minute ago, and to take it for ourselves and to share it amongst other people who are in a similar position to us and who are sick and tired really of, of a system which is misfiring on so many levels, and just trying to change it by empowering themselves. So we're really keen to share all the knowledge that we're gaining as we move forwards, with all the different projects and processes.
Yeah, and I think this idea of we have a lot of what we already need is something that's very present, I find, in the worker cooperative movement too. The idea of oh, how are we going to run this business without a boss? And what does the boss in this particular context do? In some cases, it's we have all the skills. In some places in New York, there's a driver-owned cooperative starting in New York City, and it's well, the cab companies don't own these cars. These are our cars that we bought. We own everything about this company except for the little thing on the phone. Why don't we just make our own little thing on the phone? So, Esteban, you want to add on to this?
Yeah, just that I think that part of for the storytelling piece and the narrative, that we need to get more comfortable leaning into democracy, and not deferring, as Hilary was saying, not deferring to economists that they're the only ones who can speak about the economy, that actually economic democracy is how we bridge ourselves to a new and just economy. And I always think about this contradiction that you can't achieve justice without democracy, but you also can't achieve democracy without justice. And so the oligarchy, the people in power, the owning class, are content to say, oh, well, that's kind of a bind you all are in. We're going to keep running the economy without you. And so I think it's incumbent on us to actually break that contradiction, that whole chicken and egg thing, by saying, well, we have little bits of justice. We have little bits of democracy. How do we expand it so that becomes a positive feedback loop and we can expand and finally achieve economic democracy? So I think about a lot of those, even the anecdote you just mentioned, Oscar, of what the current practitioners, activists, visionaries who are already in that space of economic democracy, despite the fact that the world is incarcerated and indebted and disenfranchised, that it matters so much that we have aspects of our communities who are already testing those waters and laying some foundation. That's where I live, in that world. But it doesn't mean that we are navel gazing and are hooray, we've achieved this thing, and seeing ourselves as vanguards or something. It's really about bringing people along and having more people experience these models. And so to the question about, who are the practitioners, who's part of this story, or sorry, who are the protagonists and who's part of this story? I kind of want to trouble this idea that I don't really know where it came from, that our target is the broad public, that we just need more awareness, that if we just had every billboard in the world or some big influencer tweet about it, everything would be solved. I don't think that's true. And I don't think that's strategic at all. I think we need to focus in and say, like, what is our strategy? What are we actually trying to move? And so from my standpoint, I think especially thinking about the work we do with freelancers, with worker owners in cooperatives, and people who are experimenting with new forms of social co-ops and multi-stakeholder co-ops, and some of these innovative things around platform cooperatives in the digital space. I think that there is particular work we could do, starting with two types of people, two characters, which is, I do think that philanthropy has an early role to play. And some of y'all are in this call, so I'm talking to you. And I think the other is workers. And again, there's a lot of artists who don't see themselves as workers. So I'm also talking to you. You are workers. And I think if we can start there, there's a certain type of, I mean, it's different work that you each need to do. Philanthropy needs to step up and invest early in growing this foundation, right? Which will then help us to connect with workers. Workers need to see themselves as laborers and need to plug in. I mean, a lot of what we do, I haven't even mentioned this, but a lot of what we do is organizing and advocacy, right? So it's not going straight from, I have this idea and then lobbying a politician. You don't have a base of power. You don't have, it might not even be relevant. Talk to the workers and make sure that the thing that they're saying is the pain point of what's going to expand their businesses, their resilience, even just removing the barriers, let alone incentivizing ways to build on these models. So make sure that it's relevant, right? So that I think is part of why we need to organize both workers and philanthropy. Then I think you bring that to politicians to make some structural changes. And I don't think it's just legislative. A lot of it is actually people who are embedded in the apparatus of government. That could be local officials, people in workforce development, small business services, food procurement. I mean, it's every aspect, right? In the executive branch. And then I think there's a certain slice of not just lobbying in terms of policy, but also doing activism with potential clients, right? So that's different than the broad public. And that's part of what I was just describing in our work with Gilded, that I think that, right, Leslie Crutchfield has this idea that if you can make markets work, that's one of those ingredients to scaling the impact of doing social good, right? So being able to make sure that people with purchasing power, which in our current economy happens to be a lot of corporations, people who might want to use or buy your product, and have them become aware, like, oh, could we be hiring a worker-owned transportation company for this, childcare company for this, branding, web development, design? We have artists, tons of artists who are involved in worker co-ops and have set up their businesses. And I think once you have organized those markets, those clients, and the politicians and elected officials and bureaucrats, for lack of a better term, then it can feed back into, now let's go to the public, because we've got all those barriers removed. We have laws that are in place that incentivize this stuff. We've been able to organize capital and all the movement around divestment from all these terrible things. We now have an apparatus and mechanisms to reinvest them in these things, so that if entrepreneurs or people in traditional businesses who are looking to convert them into being worker owned, we've now facilitated the process of bringing that new economy online.
Right. Laura, do you want to add to that?
I was just going to add yes to all of that. I think for me, like, Daniel and Hilary's work is such a good example of that. And I think the kind of emergent movement and all of these pilots of guaranteed income that are happening across the US right now are a perfect example of, like, how do you start by trying something, by showing people what it can look like, instead of, I think a lot of times we start in this place of, like, let's advocate for this policy. Like, if you take guaranteed income or debt forgiveness as an example, like, we can talk about it forever, we can publish, we can write white papers, but you have to kind of show it to people. And I think that's a thing that artists are particularly adept at doing, is saying, here, on this scale in this neighborhood, I can show you that something else is possible. I can show you that this can work. We can imagine a future that could be different, and then we can figure out how to kind of sell it to the next set of stakeholders. But I'm particularly in this moment, I'm really moved and inspired by people who are willing to say, let's try, let's, is there anything that's working about the way we've been doing it? Let's try something different. And let's see what that feels like and learn by doing. And I think that's a piece when we talk about narrative change that gets left out a lot, is that, when you say narrative change, it maybe feels like it all lives in the storytelling, but it's also in people's like lived experience of seeing something happen, even at a really small scale.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So this is a question I also posed to Esteban, and I'd like to hear the others. Maybe Laura, you touched on this a little bit, but Dan and Hilary, you already answered this question. The question is, how did you come across the idea that you want to bring to the world? And you mentioned you came to the U.S. You met with they were strike debt at the time and Occupy Wall Street, and now they're the Debt Collective. And that helped bring some new clarity to you that you translated into your work. Let me put Esteban on the spot here. Let me ask you directly about, like, what was your journey into the worker cooperative space? What were those little the people, the figures, the local, whether they were local, niche, the characters that drew you in, that really started your story around this movement?
Yeah, I mean, I got involved. My origins in this start pretty early. I mean, as a teenager, it didn't actually start directly at the solidarity economy and cooperative economics. It started with youth organizing, mostly from cultural movements. So I was really involved as a musician and an organizer in the punk community, kind of dipping my toe into activism, doing projects like Food Not Bombs and anti-racist action, things like that in the 90s. And so from there, I was already exposed to political vision around what a critique of the state, first of all, and this is like right on the heels of Thatcher and Reagan, and at the time Clintonian neoliberalism, right? The WTO and all of that stuff, and then inspired by work that the Zapatistas were doing. So that all came to me through culture first, through zines and reading liner notes and records, and going on tour with my band and playing punk shows and connecting to organizers who were in their local community all over. And yet the question kept coming up, well, yeah, we have all these critiques, we have some processes around deliberation and consensus decision-making and spokes council models and flattening things and not having things be hierarchical, but what are we doing economically? I mean, other than mutual aid, which was great back then, as an example and as inspiration. And so I was already kind of critically on the lookout for models of it. And then I moved to Berkeley, California as a student at UC Berkeley, and they just so happened to have started back in the 1930s what became the largest student co-op in the US. And it's already its own ecosystem. So there's a set of 20-something housing co-ops, and I lived in them for my undergraduate time there, but also a warehouse that did collective purchasing, thousands of dollars a week. And then we had a fleet of trucks that we would load up and drive around to our 23 properties to redistribute based on what all the different houses offered. And so that was one of my first work shifts. All the students had to do a work shift. That was one of my first work shifts as a participant in that cooperative. Is it a worker co-op? Is it a housing co-op? Is it a student? I mean, it's kind of a mixture of all of those things. And in Europe, they would call it a social co-op, which is really what it was. And yet they didn't see themselves explicitly as challenging some of these larger embedded structures in our society. It was sort of like, oh, we're just trying to be experts at what we're doing here, which is great and fulfilling and helpful around making college affordable, making it accessible, making food affordable. It was also room and board. So we had these industrial kitchens, and we had to pass, health inspections with the city, and we would feed people who would pay to be boarders, right? So it's almost like a restaurant kind of catering co-op as well. And so in experiencing that, I realized, wait a minute, let me connect these dots here. This is exactly what all these anarchists and punks are talking about, what we want to be doing in the world. And yet here is this business that I am an equal owner of, along with all the other students here. And we employed a staff of 20 something people, and they weren't members, they were our staff. They were grown-ups doing bookkeeping and property management stuff. And yet we were dealing with millions of dollars in purchasing annually and in real estate in the Bay Area during the dot-com boom, right? So we had 20 something houses that were each worth, tens of millions of dollars. So that was just, for me, part of the story of how I got involved and how it was demonstrative. Like, it showed that this is possible, not just as a practice, but also at scale, where we had, up to 2,000 students who were involved. And I was like, oh, there's a way to connect this all up. And eventually I ended up at our founding conference for the Worker Co-op Federation, kind of tied to my organizing from Berkeley. And maybe that's the tightest I can make my story, my own narrative about how I find myself in this work.
Right. A lot of it is part of the answer, not the whole answer, but part of the answer is the dots were out there, and they occasionally get connected, and they occasionally get disrupted or disconnected. And over time, with ebbs and flows of movements and people and forms of music, even those dots get reconnected over time. It started with punk. It started with those conversations and those relationships. And it's really something that I find repetitive in a fulfilling way about my work. Is I've done over 500, I think, stories now over the past 5 years, and a lot of it is about worker cooperatives, real estate cooperatives, different ways of running and owning banks and credit unions. And it's almost like a dirty little secret. Is almost every story is the same. It starts with a bunch of people having a conversation, and just keeping that conversation going until let's start out doing this. And maybe it doesn't work out the first time, but the same people learn and start out something else, and then that's the thing that takes off and becomes what we see operating today. And it may not work today. I don't know. I don't write about only things that work and scale and are the massive. Or have a massive reach just yet, because if I did that, I'd only be writing about largely white male-owned ideas and initiatives and programs, because almost everything else is at an earlier stage. So we're cutting in now into our audience Q&A work, and I do have one question I want to bring to you all. I think you have something to say about this. So this comes from Phoebe. And she says, thanks for all your amazing work. Phoebe asks, I've been thinking a lot about embodied financialization. I think she's referring to like the physical body, right? The ways in which our bodies and minds are oriented to perpetuate systems of capital production. Have any of you piloted or worked on efforts to unlearn financialization in our heads, hearts, and bodies? I think you all have something to say about that. I don't know who wants to go first. No. Laura?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. I'm sure there are people who are doing more of that work. I think I know a lot of artists who are doing that work, and I think for Springboard, I think one of the biggest both tensions and strengths in our work is this idea that we have to both provide the resources and connections and systems to help people participate in the world as it is, and also make sure that we are working on changing those systems and changing that world at the same time. And so I think for us, that means trying to kind of toggle between workshops that are directly what you're talking about, like really helping people commodify their work and think about how to get paid and think about how to, make sure that as freelancers, they're handling their invoices like Esteban was talking about earlier, and not spending a ton of time on that, and having the right systems and paying their taxes and all of those things. But trying to also balance that and pair that with some of the work that I think gets more at what you're talking about. So particularly over the last year, we have engaged a number of artists to lead kind of wellness practice and practice that is around kind of stepping outside of those systems and finding different ways of valuing yourself and your work, and caring for your body. And some of that is a kind of somatic practice that I think gets at some of what you're talking about. And I think there are artists who are doing that work for sure. I can put a couple links in the chat to some artists.
So another question, just for the sake of time, I want to get you guys to get some input on this, because I'm sure you have some. Any suggested recommended reading on solidarity or cooperative economics from the folks on that we have here today?
We really love Ashley Dawson's book,
People's Power.
People's Power. Really... It's published by the same imprint that Creditocracy was by Andrew Ross, which is All Books in New York. And it's a great book which champions decentralized energy and also energy democracy, and also looks at cooperatively owned energy companies across Europe, the US, and I think
Germany mainly.
But also there was a really interesting one in Detroit, wasn't there, as well, that we're hoping to speak to them.
Solarity.
Anyway,
it was like
Ashley Dawson, it's the name of the writer, New York writer. So that's a goodie.
Esteban?
Yeah, I was saying in the chat that there are plenty of books. They're pretty good. They tend to skew a little more academic, so they're not like the most popular and accessible and easy to read. But some of them are. I think I usually channel people toward a lot of the really great journalistic work that you've done, Oscar, and documentaries, interviews, and podcasts, of which there are many. Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis, their documentary, The Take, which kind of follows that story from the financial crisis in Argentina in the early 2000s. We've screened it at some of our conferences. Moving Image Pictures has done some documentaries in the US and in Spain, looking at Mondragon, looking at Italy. Laura Flanders has done a lot of interviews with worker owners in various different kinds of cooperative industries. And then Nathan Schneider has a great book called Everything for Everyone. He's a professor of media and journalism out in Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado, but he has written several books, and a lot of them really do look very closely at cooperative forms. And lastly, some of our members from an interpretation co-op just did the latest translation of an old piece by Father Arizmendi Arrieta, who's the founder of the Mondragon cooperative system in Spain. So he has a really short piece called Reflections, and it's almost like poetic. They're these little vignettes. It's not like a chapter kind of sequence thing. And the new translation is just beautiful. I mean, it talks a lot about solidarity and worker power. I mean, he's a Catholic priest, so it's a little bit rooted in that tradition. But I find, I mean, especially at that larger, what is the value and the principle and the framework? I've just in reading the new translation, have found that really inspirational. So maybe that's a place to get started. Oh, and lastly, Jessica Gordon-Emhard, who's a professor at John Jay College, has a book, and this is one of the more academic ones, called Collective Courage, and it's a history of African-American solidarity economy practice that mostly focuses on the 20th century, although it dips a toe into some of the origins in the 19th century in the US. with our origins with the Knights of Labor before we kind of spun off in separate, although not opposing directions, where the union movement went in one direction and the worker co-op movement became its own thing. And so she talks about some of the early economic aspect of the civil rights movement and all the organizers from A. Philip Randolph to Ella Jo Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, who were involved in that work, which was basically erased because of white supremacy culture,
Yes.
and has been reclaimed through her scholarship
Right.
about 7 or 8 years ago.
And I would also say not that long, despite being an academic, Collective Courage is not that long of a book. If folks are looking for a quicker introduction to the history of African-American cooperative economics in the US.
And my best friend wrote there's a graphic novel adaptation that's on its way.
Oh,
so I connected him with Jessica to because I was like, this book is wonderful. I want people with a less familiarity with academic tests to be able to absorb it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Laura, any last minutes recommendations for us?
Sure, I'll just add a couple. If you're interested specifically in guaranteed income, I think if you start with the Mayors for Guaranteed Income Network and connect there to UPenn, has a whole Center for Guaranteed Income research now, and there's a lot of great resources coming out of that. And then there's also a brand new report commissioned by grant makers in the arts about specifically the intersection of arts and solidarity economy work. I'll put the link in the chat. I think it's art.coop.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much to all our panelists, Dan, Hilary, Laura, and Esteban. It's been really great to moderate this panel. Again, I'm Oscar Perry Abello, Senior Economics Correspondent at Next City. And it's been really a lot of fun. And I hope you guys got as much out of it, and the audience got as much out of it as we did, I think. And just being here and sharing our stories together. So thanks again to Mural Arts and Alexis for bringing us all together. And I think I'm turning it back over to Nathaniel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Oscar, Esteban, Laura, Hilary, and Dan. This was an incredible conversation. My mind is like little explosions going on everywhere in my brain right now with all of this. So just wanting to thank you all, wanting to thank everyone who joined us this week, today, as well, for this Art and Environmental Justice Symposium. Everyone here, you all have the power. We have the power to continue to imagine new realities together, to demonstrate to folks what is possible. So just keep doing all of the amazing work you are all doing. Please let us know about how we've done this week with the symposium, as well as what you'd like to see more of. We have a short survey that we'd love to share with you. I think my colleague's going to pop that link into the chat. We'll also send it out to folks as well through email, along with a lot of the references we heard today and from even some of the other conversations this week. We are working on compiling all of this information so that we can make it available to folks, because there was just so much that was shared over this past week. Next up, to close out the day and head into the weekend, we invite you to join us, Institute staff, and others for a social hour. You can join us virtually with your drink of choice during this opportunity to meet and celebrate others engaged in this work at the intersection of arts, culture, and environmental justice. There's a different link for this. We'll open up this space in about, I think in 10 minutes or so at 2:35. Very informal, just come hang out. It's a good moment for great conversation. Also, just wanting to make sure you all know that the Mural Arts Institute does regularly organize different conversations and learning opportunities. If you'd like more information on future opportunities like this one, you can sign up for a quarterly newsletter as well. And we also want to invite you to join Mural Arts Philadelphia for our annual fundraiser called Wall Ball, the Art of Wellbeing, on June 10th, which is virtual and open to the general public for the first time with a pay what you wish option. And my friends will throw that link in the chat as well. And I don't think I have anything else to say. This was an incredible week, so inspirational, and just thanking everyone once more for joining us. Take care.